Hi, this is Heidi Burgess. Today I want to talk about massively parallel, complexity-oriented reconciliation. Before I explain what that mouthful means, though, I want to give a little bit of history. In 2003, we were just beginning to write Beyond Intractability, and we asked Chip House to write an article on reconciliation. He did, leading with the notion that reconciliation had become one of the hottest topics in the increasingly hot field of conflict resolution. He went on to say that when he wrote a book in 1995, reconciliation was not mentioned once. But by 2001, he said, it was his most frequently cited concept. In 2017, I was going back over the various Beyond Intractability essays, looking to see which ones needed updating. I said then that Chip's essay was especially in need of updating. I was reacting particularly to his observation that reconciliation had become a hot topic. I said that it was not such a hot topic in 2017, though it badly needed to be. Well, it turns out that wasn't entirely true. Rather, it depends where you look. I was looking primarily at political conflicts in the United States and Europe. This was 2 years after Brexit, a year after Donald Trump was elected president in the United States. Most of the attention was not on reconciliation between the left and the right. Rather, in the U.S., on the left, the attention was being given to how to resist Trump and how to win the next time around. This was true for the Republicans too, of course. During the Obama administration, they certainly were not looking at reconciling. They were trying to block absolutely everything Obama was doing, and were trying to lay the groundwork for winning in 2016, which they did indeed do. The trend only worsened over the next 4 years, leading to an extremely bitter election in 2020 that both sides thought they couldn't possibly lose. Guy wrote an interesting series of 6 blog posts on the dynamics that surrounded that notion, where it came from, and where it's likely to lead to, and I'll put that in the reference area for anyone who's interested. Indeed, the Republicans did everything they could think of to win. Even after the votes were counted, recounted, verified, certified by the states, challenged in the courts across the country, found to be valid in each of the 50 states, still fully 147 congressmen and senators, led by Josh Hawley, a Republican from Missouri, tried to get the Senate and then Mike Pence in particular to deny Joe Biden's victory. And then, of course, we got this, the attack on the Capitol. This leaves both Congress and the American people in quite a predicament. Clearly, reconciliation is needed now more than ever. But it's also going to be harder to achieve, perhaps, than ever. Certainly much harder than it might have been before the attack on the Capitol. Just look at the discussions going on about what to do about it. Some people are advocating moving on, letting President Biden get on with his agenda without looking back, and hoping that to do so will allow some successful bipartisanship. Others are calling for full retributive justice, starting with the impeachment of the president and the indictment on sedition charges of many others. Not until justice is served, they assert, is any bipartisanship, in other words, reconciliation, possible. Well, there was a lot of reconciliation and peacebuilding going on at the time that all this was happening in the United States. It just wasn't happening here. But it was going on in Africa, in South America, Asia, the Middle East. Most of the peacebuilding organizations that I knew of that were based in the United States were working in other places, and they were not paying much attention to what was going on here. Simon Keyes, in an article that mapped reconciliation activities in 2018, noted that to talk about reconciliation is to join a crowded conversation in which hundreds of people are talking from different positions in different languages. He went on to say that there were 150 new articles of reconciliation just in 2019. 100 countries had reconciliation programs and 90 had truth commissions. So certainly there was a lot of activity going on, but it wasn't in the United States. And that's still pretty much true now, but that might be beginning to change. The run-up to the November 2020 election got so hostile that there were organizations who specialize in predicting when violence is going to break out overseas, which were warning that violence could very well break out in the United States. There was a lot of talk about the need to cool the rhetoric and calm things down. And of course, January 6th suggests they were right. Indeed, Joe Biden tried to cool things down in his victory speech, a portion of which is copied here. He said, "I pledge to be a president who seeks not to divide but to unify, who doesn't see red states and blue states, but a United States." Few Republicans reciprocated that attitude, unfortunately. And, as I said before, 147 Republicans tried to force either Congress or Vice President Pence to overturn the election results. That poisoned the reconciliation well profoundly, and the coup de grace, of course, came with the attack on the Capitol. But that might have been a bridge too far. Even Mitch McConnell and Liz Cheney, the number 3 Republicans in the Senate, began to call for Trump's impeachment for inciting the riot. So maybe, just maybe, our leaders and/or maybe the citizens will finally realize that we're going to have to reconcile if we want to prosper. Indeed, I've been saying for a while, we are going to have to reconcile if we're going to survive at all. There are a number of organizations in the U.S. that are working for reconciliation. The Bridge Alliance is one that has been in existence for quite a while. I couldn't find on their website a date when they were founded, but I know they were founded before Trump was elected. They try to bridge the difference between conservatives and liberals. And as I said, they've been doing it for quite a long time. More organizations started to get on this bandwagon in the run-up to the 2020 election. The Alliance for Peacebuilding formed a U.S. working group, and if you go to their website and go to the URL that's shown on this slide, and I'll put it in the resource area, you'll find lots and lots of resources on U.S. peacebuilding. Books, videos, AFP statements, news stories, anti-racism resources, and a very useful Building Trust handbook. Similarly, Search for Common Ground is, I believe, the biggest peacebuilding organization in the world, and until recently they weren't working in the United States either. However, they do now have United States projects because they also realize that there is a grave need for peacebuilding and reconciliation in the United States. So now I want to turn my attention to the question of what reconciliation is, and what I meant by that mouthful of words, complexity-oriented, massively parallel reconciliation. When we originally started teaching this class, we showed this rather standard bell curve. You may have seen something like it before. It's a rather traditional notion about how conflicts develop. The idea is that tensions begin to grow, but they don't erupt. Things start out relatively quietly, but then they get tenser. On the graph, this is shown as latent conflict. And then there's a triggering incident, and the conflict emerges, and then usually quickly escalates with increasing intensity over time. Eventually, you get to a stalemate, or what Bill Zartman called a hurting stalemate, which is the point where it becomes obvious that neither side can win, and both sides are hurting or getting damaged by the conflict. This was the point that Zartman claimed was ripe for reconciliation or negotiation, because once both sides realize that they can't win and they're getting hurt, if rationality prevailed, they would negotiate. So the notion was that that's when de-escalation and negotiation happens. And then at the end of negotiation, that's when you get dispute settlements and peace agreements. And it's only after dispute settlements and peace agreement stage that you supposedly get what was called post-conflict peace building or reconciliation or resolution. But there still is a question as to whether reconciliation can ever really be achieved, and whether it can be worked toward before you have a dispute settlement or peace agreement. Those are issues that we'll be talking about as time goes on. If we look at this diagram a little more carefully, we'll see it has some problems. One of the problems with it is it has two different types of entities. It has what I call statuses or situations, such as latent conflict or hurting stalemate, which are the way things are at a particular point in time. And then you have processes: conflict emergence, escalation, de-escalation, settlement, peace building. Those are processes, and they can lead to any number of states or statuses: resolution, transformation, reconciliation, stable peace. What Rob Rosigliano calls peace writ large, and what I sometimes have called happily ever after. Whatever you call it, the general image is that the conflict is fixed. Everything's working the way it should be, relationships are mended, structures are mended, everyone's happy. So one problem with the diagram is that it shows statuses and processes as if they're the same thing. In my new slide here, I added the term nouns and verbs because I also sometimes talk about reconciliation as a noun or reconciliation as a verb. But there's also the question about how far you can get down the right side of this diagram. One of the common problems in intractable conflicts is you never do get down the right side of that bell curve. If at the top one side defeats the other instead of running into a hurting stalemate, that tends to create repression and latent hostility, which will cause renewed conflict and escalation. Then the conflict will just start over again. And even if you don't have the defeat of one side, if you do have a hurting stalemate, and you do get de-escalation for a while, if progress isn't rapid enough, or one side thinks that it's not being treated well enough, you can easily get latent hostility and start the cycle over again. So in an earlier version of this video, Guy argued that conflict is actually a breaking wave, and you have to deal with all the stages simultaneously, and be very careful to stay on your feet, or else you'll get badly battered around. Then he drew a diagram that looked like this. This is the schematic of a breaking ocean wave. You just get caught in a circle: escalation, stalemate, de-escalation, stalemate, round and round. Unless you can come up with an exit option. Now, with the concept of reconciliation, what's the exit option? Well, it's usually peacemaking and peacekeeping, which are not part of reconciliation, but they enable people and countries sometimes to get out of that vicious circle and start following the blue arrow off in a better direction towards reconciliation. The key here is, can you keep traveling on that blue arrow, or will you revert back into the cycle and just keep on going round and round? Again, in an earlier video, we likened this to a rocket taking off. When a rocket takes off, it has to reach a certain speed and a certain height in order to break through the atmosphere and go into Earth orbit. So you can imagine the escape velocity as being something similar to what you need to establish to follow the blue arrow and to get out of that vicious cycle. So we continued with the multi-stage rocket metaphor and applied it to reconciliation and peace building. Stage 1 was peacemaking and peacekeeping, which was not part of reconciliation, but set you up so you got out of the circle and escaped Earth orbit. Stage 2 was prospective reconciliation, looking forward. It's looking towards a positive vision of how to live together in the future and figuring out what it's going to take to get there. Stage 3 was retrospective reconciliation, where you look backward at the harms done, as if you were looking down at the earth, if you want to keep on going with the metaphor. Stage 3, retrospective reconciliation, comes after Stage 2, because we argue that it's easier to figure out how to deal with the past if you know where you're trying to get to in the future. Stages 4 and 5 are implementing those visions. Stage 4 is implementing the vision at the interpersonal and the intergroup level, and Stage 5 is implementing it at the societal level. While all that seems to make sense, there's a problem with this metaphor, which is that rockets are very complicated systems. But they're not human systems, which are complex. Wendell Jones taught us the difference between complicated and complex adaptive systems back in 2003, and this is a very important distinction. Complicated systems are determined systems. The pieces are put together according to a plan, and they work in a predictable way. That's not to say they don't break, but usually everything works as planned, and you can predict what will happen. The relationship between inputs and outputs is linear, and it's predictable. But complex systems aren't that way. They are indeterminate. Wendell talked about flocks of birds as an example of a relatively simple complex system, at least when you compare it to people. Birds fly according to particular rules. There's usually a leader, and they have rules they're supposed to follow the leader or the bird in front of them. But they're not supposed to get so close as to hit each other. But even when the agents, that's what individual entities in complex systems are called by systems theorists, even when the agents act according to preset rules, the outcome is unpredictable. The relationships between inputs and outputs is not linear. The birds are not linear. Sometime one bird will make a small change, and that will send the whole flock off in a new direction. And sometimes there will be a big change, but very little will happen. In his earlier video, Guy went on to demonstrate this in a series of slides that show pool tables. Now this pool table has a whole lot of balls, but it only has one player. So the goal of that player is to hit balls one at a time and get them all in the pocket and all the balls to disappear. And if the player is good and understands physics, the player should be able to do that. Because in a complicated system, you can still predict if the ball is hit straight on, it will go straight on. And if it hits another ball, both balls will go off in a predictable way. You can tell what's going to happen. That's a complicated system. A complex system is one where you have lots of people who are hitting balls, try to affect where the other ones are going. And on top of that, all of the balls themselves are moving. You might notice that I started to put little arrows by some of the balls, showing that they are all moving on their own. But I decided that was ridiculous, as it would have taken me all day to put in all those little arrows. But in a complex system, each one of the entities has its own decisions to make, and its own decision rules, which in the case of birds are all the same, but in the case of humans, all the decision rules are different. So you rapidly get a very, very complex systems that can either adapt well or badly to changes in its environment. But either way, it's not at all predictable. Now, when you apply this notion to reconciliation, what you see are there are lots of different people in organizations who have different definitions of reconciliation. Just look at 6 definitions I took out of Key's article. Some people say that reconciliation is the building of new narratives. So one of the players in this pool game is trying to get people to build new narratives. Someone else is trying to establish new social norms. John Paul Lederach tries to balance peace, truth, justice, and mercy. Others emphasize shared visions. Others emphasize changing relationships from negative ones to positive ones. Robert Sigliano talks about changing structures, attitudes, and transactions at the interpersonal and societal level. So you have lots of different images of what reconciliation is and how it is brought about. Complexity-oriented reconciliation says all of them are right. It's not that one's right and one's wrong. You have to do all of those things simultaneously to get to reconciliation. And you have to do it at the intrapersonal level, the psychological level. You have to do it at the interpersonal level, the community level, the national level, and the international level to reach full reconciliation. And what's the goal? Is it to get all of the entities to line up doing just exactly what you told them to do? And when they're lined up, stay that way? No. They're still scattered all over. They still have different roles. They have different values and decision rules. They still have different interests and needs. But they have an image of the future that is compatible. They have improved relationships, so they're not fighting with each other over everything. And everybody is working to some degree in parallel. If I were to draw this today, I would not have all of those arrows going exactly parallel, but closer to it than going every which way. Because everybody is working towards a similar goal of a better society in which everybody would like to live. That's my definition of reconciliation. The notion of massively parallel means that all these folks are working roughly in concert, not directed by anybody, because complex adaptive systems cannot be directed or run by anybody. If you have somebody who's in charge, that means the system is complicated, not complex. In complex systems, you have lots of individual actors doing their own thing. They can work approximately in concert, so you can assist them at the end where everybody does indeed live happily ever after. Now, whether or not we can really get to that point will be a matter we will be discussing over quite some time. But it does seem like a goal worth pursuing. So we'll be talking much more about how to do that. Thanks.